often a number associated with them. For kettles, there were 13. For pan sizes, there were 8. And size numbering systems varied. I've seen them in different catalogs that number 1 is the largest and they get smaller as the number increased, and I've seen it the other way around. I believe the listings on our blotter are increasing. So, as we mentioned before, nests were a common way of shipping, smaller sizes fitting in a larger one. And what that means in terms of kettles were typically made square. And that means that the diameter is roughly equal to the height. So the bigger the kettle diameter, the taller it was going to be. A number 12 or 13 is going to be pushing almost 3 gallons. So that would be a 10 to 10 and a half inch diameter, kettle about 10 inches high. It's roughly equivalent to a 2.5 or 2 3/4 sheet kettle from the colonial era. And I made one once and measured it, and it came out at 2 3/4 gallon. Pans are a little bit different in that the nests might be the same size. Milk pans were often shipped in what were referred to as nests, but it was just a stack of the same size fitting in it. But I think that from the kettle standpoint, the number 1 being the smallest, it's going to be on the order of a 4.5 inch diameter. And that's just about the largest size you can get out of a single 14 inch sheet. You can't get them too tight together and be able to nest them. A 1/2 inch is probably a little generous, but you can't do much under about 3/8, maybe a 1/4 if you're really good. So the size 13 is, if it goes up in a 1/2 inch increments, is going to end up in what I know to be the larger size kettles, which would be 10 to 10.5 inch diameter. So one of the things, if you remember the 1855 blotter, there were only 9 items on it. So one of the questions was, in my mind, was, well, what about other years? Was it a slow year? So I went back and looked at the 1848, and basically there was even less on it. The sales and trade was only in kettles. There were a few other things identified. For Mr. Ross's trips to Cowlitz Farm, for example, there was a tin kettle, 2 camp plates, a tin pot, a tin pan, a spoon, a knife, 1 fork, 7 horses. All of them returned. And then provisions were provided to Coat and a party headed for Victoria, along with sundries. They lent him a tin kettle, a number 1 tin kettle, and it was returned. And then same thing for Mr. Fenton's trip to Victoria. Going back further to the 1834 blotter, there was no sale or trade of tin noted. However, there were some items listed as in use. 2 candlesticks, a funnel, a tea kettle, 4 tin canoe kettles, 2 tin lamps, and a tin teapot. So there's not a lot, given the fact that Mr. Passamore advertised 78 items plus too many more numerous to be mentioned, we're not seeing all of that. Now, it's not a big surprise if you go back all the way to 1834, because there just wasn't a need for it. But by 1855, you're starting to see a major shift in where tinware could be received from. So, looking a little further in the information that we have here at the fort is if you look at some of the invoices, you find a lot more things. They didn't get sold. And that's an interesting aspect even of the 1855 blotter, because there were a number of kettles that went across the blotter, but they were for payment of debts, hiring of people, and just exchange for work. So there were a lot of things that also ended up, there were a number of items, the pans typically ended up, a number of pans ended up designated as for pantry use or for kitchen use. And it's interesting that there was a distinction between the pantry and the kitchen. So from these invoices, you can see that there are a number of other things. There were a number of Britannia metal items. Teaspoons was a big one. Soup ladles. Britannia metal teapots. It's interesting to me that this one's, in terms of how big it is listed as 12 gills. I'm going, why can't you just say 6 cups? But that's a difference in the way units were used in the time period. Probably the most interesting thing is there were 5 of Patau's patent coffee pots on this invoice. Thank you, Elizabeth, for finding that and finding the patent itself. Well, if there's time, we will talk about what that is. But it's an 1840-ish invention that ended up here. English invention. There's an English patent. So, next slide, please. So, just to kind of try and summarize this portion of it, tin ownership, who has what? It was used by everybody. It's ubiquitous. Somebody's going to have, I mean, if you're here, you're going to have some. It might only be a mug and a kettle, but, excuse me, a pot and a kettle. So the most common things were what we saw on the blotter, the pots, kettles, pans, other common kitchen items. However, specialty items could be ordered, or by 1855, you could purchase them in the local town stores in addition to the Hudson Bay store. So the example of Plateau's coffee pot, they obviously ordered that. And again, the more expensive items were less likely to be found in some laborer's home. So we're going to switch the direction of the talk a little bit, and we've talked about what's here in terms of tinware, what was here on site. What I'd like to do now is talk about tinsmiths in the Oregon and Washington Territory. Where did they come from? And like everybody else that ended up out here, we all emigrated at some point. They were participants in the fur trade. There were immigrants that came across the Oregon Trail that were tinsmiths, and immigrants that came by sea and crossed the Isthmus of Panama to get here. So, next slide, please. The very first tinsmith that I can document, at least west of the Cascades, because there might have been somebody at Spokane House or Fort Walla Walla earlier, or in the same time frame. But Louis Bivette is the earliest one that I can find. He was a Northwest Company tinsmith in 1821. And that's the year that Hudson Bay and Northwest Company were forced to merge. So he was also a Hudson Bay tinsmith at Fort George. He was there long enough to end up at Fort Vancouver. Joseph Turgan succeeded him at Fort Vancouver, and also, I'm not sure, the reference I was looking at also describes him as the Columbia Department Sundries Account tinsmith, which I'm not certain that that means something different than being at Fort Vancouver. It's certainly a larger area than just the immediate surrounding of the fort, but Fort Vancouver was the headquarters of McLaughlin's old Oregon empire and encompassed a lot of ground. So I'm not sure, I don't understand the distinction, but it was there in the listing. And then Francois Chamberlain was actually born in Montreal and came to Fort Vancouver when Dr. McLaughlin was back there and came out in 1837. He was originally a middleman. That means he paddled one of the middle positions in the canoe. And then he was the tinsmith at Fort Vancouver from 1839 to 1841. So these are the earliest tinsmiths I've been able to find in the Washington, Oregon territory. So what about people that came over the Oregon Trail? So this was a very interesting rabbit hole, because a fellow tinsmith told me he had read this book and remembered that there were a couple of passages about tinsmiths. So I read the book. So there is circa 1858, which is close as I can put it, so I think it's probably started about 53 when they arrived. It was reported by Mrs. Easterbrook, who was the daughter of of David Love, who was the brother of John. They came across the Oregon Trail in 1853, and Mrs. Easterbrook reported about a visit her parents paid to the brother John in 1858, saying that he had a tin shop in Jacksonville. So Jacksonville, Oregon had a tin shop very early on. Mrs. Gilbert, who was the daughter of John Macaulay, who in 1852, 40 members of the family crossed the plains. They settled in Harrisburg, Oregon, and built the first house and the first store. And then the brother Asa actually made a trip back to Philadelphia for a stock of goods for the store. And in her description, she said that father, who was John, and his brothers were mechanics, good brick masons, and tinsmiths. My father and his brother packed pork, made flour, and manufactured tinware. So Harrisburg had a tinsmith. So, other than from a tinsmith directly, stores carried tinware. And there are some example newspaper articles that I have found. There were 3 different, very large and very frequent and early advertisers, especially Moses and Barnes, but even Terry was, I think, about the same time frame. It just his ads were less regular. But you could see that they advertised tinware. There was also a shop in Port Townsend that sold tinware. So these are what I found. Olympia, reasonably close. But my favorite, next slide please, is Stillicone. Balch and Palmer. Balch is the founder of Port Stillicone, 1851. And by 1853, he's advertising his store and carrying tinware. George Gallagher arrives 1853 in Olympia and has a store, but by 1859 he has, by 1858 he has moved to Stillicone, and he is advertising opening a version of his store in Stillicone. Next slide, please. So here is George. There's a little argument about when he was born. If you look at the census records in the 1850 census, it describes his age as 25, which would say he was born in 25. But in the 1860 census, it says he was 31, and if they're really 10 years apart, there's a problem there. So I found it highly amusing to read the 1850 census for his home in New York. And on the line, as head of the household, under occupation, it said, "Gone to California."
Full-time job.
So I can place him in San Francisco in the two things. There was a San Francisco census in 1852 that he shows up, and he was listed as a tinsmith. He also ran for delegate to the Democratic Convention in the 6th Ward in San Francisco. So one of the things you'll note through a couple of these, and more so in other things that I found, he was intimately involved in community politics and in the community in general. So he opens his tin shop in Olympia in 1853. In 1855, Mrs. George, his wife's name was Jane Gallagher, and 3 children arrived in Olympia on the brig Halcyon. I didn't note it here, but George's brother Henry also traveled with them and arrived at the same time. In 1856, he served on the committee investigating Governor Stevens' enforcement of martial law, so he was a political player. In 1858, he is a signatory to the Stillicone Library Association founding. So if you go to the Stillicone Historic Society, one of the things I found visiting there is they have a picture of the signing document for the formation of the library on the wall, and signatory number 22 is George. In 1859, he established a tin shop in Stillicone, and his earliest advertisement was in the Puget Sound Herald on February 11th. In 1862, he was Adjutant General for the Washington Territory. 1863, he was the president of the Steilacoom Library, and he died in August 2nd, 1865. So if you look at his household, especially what was in the 1860 census, you will note that there is a large gap after the child Mary in terms of the age. So they had 3 children before George went to California. And after the family arrived in Washington, they had 3 more. But in addition to that, there were 3 other members of his household. Wallace Myers was a tinsmith. I'm assuming that because he's part of George's household that he worked for George, as well as the 2 laborers. Next slide, please. So the tin shop, this is Steilacoom. I forget what the date is, late 1850s, maybe 1860. This building here is a tin shop, and if you blow that up, swing very carefully, you can read that it's hardware and tinware. So after his death, his wife Jane and his son, also named George, which is confusing if you start trying to do the research, continued to run the shop. And in the 1870 census, it lists George as a tinsmith. So, and with that, that's the regular remarks I have ready for you all. Anybody interested in Patau's coffee pot?
Yes.
So here's the coffee pot. It came in 2 varieties. I'm suspecting that number 2 is the one that ended up here, but you never know. There was a patent. We'll get to that in a minute. It was written up in 2 areas. One was a description in Murray's Modern Cookery book, and that goes into a lot of detail on different types of coffee, making coffee. But it also showed up in Mechanics Magazine as a new invention. So next slide, please. So this is the patent drawing on the right-hand side. And in terms of making coffee in Plateau's coffee pot, water is put into the upper vessel. You have to slightly unscrew it into its fitting into the lower vessel, and that allows the water to flow into the bottom vessel. Tighten it back up, and the plate they're referring to is right there. Put your coffee grounds on that. And then you put the heat source underneath, and as it generates heat, or as it heats up, it starts to form steam, which builds up the pressure in the upper part of this lower chamber and pushes the hot water up through into the upper level to make the coffee. When you're satisfied that it's all mixed into your liking, you pull the heat out from underneath it, and the steam condenses, and that pulls the coffee down into the lower part. And if you've got the fancy version, you have a spigot that you can draw your coffee. So, next slide, please. So here's some of the descriptors in terms of what we were talking about in terms of what it makes up. There's an outer vessel, and then a cylindrical vessel, and then there is an outer case. So the vessel that the coffee is made in is this inner one, and this is the outer case. The upper vessel with the descending tube. That's the tube that the water flows up in and all the way. There's the perforated plate, and it's held in place by a little screw. And there's a small hole in the tube that keeps you from getting vapor locked when it's time to heat it up and then allow it to coffee drain back down. It allows the coffee to actually drain back down into the lower level. Without that little vent, you wouldn't get the drainage. So that's the coffee bar.
So it's essentially an early percolator.
So it's actually not a percolator, it's more of a pour over. It's just pushing the water up and then draining it back down. It doesn't have the thermosiphon type of behavior that a percolator has. Percolators came along a little later. So,
Do you have any plans to make one?
no. There are things that are well past my capability, and this is one of them.
5 before it.
Yeah, if we just find the appropriate artifact. So, thank you all. I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have. Yes?
Going back to the Fort Vancouver and Fort George Tinsmiths, I was wondering, the last fellow, the middleman, was there any indication that he trained as a tinsmith after arriving, or do you suspect he probably had previous training and just changed jobs or acquired the additional job once he was out here?
So it's a good question, and we won't know. Tinsmithing, in the 1830s, it was still an apprenticeship job. However, it is a simple enough craft, and people in that era were so much more used to working with their hands and doing things. Every farmer was to some degree or another a blacksmith, just simply because they had to be. So it's possible that he picked it up after he arrived here, or arrived at Fort Vancouver. It's also possible that he was trained. But the fact that he was a middleman kind of makes me think that it's more likely that he picked it up after he got here. But he could also have been a runaway from his apprenticeship too. Yes?
Back on like one of the early slides when you were talking about the different things like that laborers might have, or people that more money might have, you mentioned like tin ceiling.
Yes.
Would people literally like cover their ceiling?
Yes.
with tin?
It was a pressed tin pattern. It was an effort to reproduce more, somewhat cheaper, all of the ornate plaster work that was done that would have patterns,
Wow.
or the tiled ceilings that were done. So it was a cheaper material to do that sort of thing. But yes, it was a real thing.
Oh.
There are some surviving examples at Fort Worden in the officers' dwellings
Yeah.
there,
Mhm.
late 1890s, I believe.
Wow.
Oh, cool.
So one of the things that happens in the tin history is the Industrial Revolution. And the consequences of that start about 1810 with the first hand-cranked machines, and runs all the way through to the end of the century. In 1847, I believe, the first patent for stamping tin pieces was issued. It didn't really go anywhere for 20 years. The owner of the patent finally moved to Boston and bought a bigger facility and started promoting it, and then it took off. It became what is known as the Dover Stamping Company, and you could order bits and pieces. So you now got to the point where you didn't have to know how to make anything, you just ordered up all of the parts and assembled them. You still had to solder it together, but you didn't necessarily have to know how to make things. So the tinsmithing that I practice is generally colonial era tinsmithing. It's all handwork over stakes. Starting in 1810, you get the hand-cranked machines, and I think it's by 1814, it was spread across all of the eastern seaboard. I mean, it was as far south as Georgia and all across colonial New England. It was in the Carolinas. You know, there weren't a huge number of them, but they were still getting out everywhere. All the larger tin shops had them. The advantage is that it was a time saver. Yes, if you have to set up the machine and get it adjusted to make one bottom for one cup, I can do it as fast by hand. But if you want to do 20, that's way faster. The other difference is it started changing the way things were made. So if you look at the mugs that I make, and it's got the crimped on bottom for the most part, that's a much more forgiving, lower tolerance requirement to get it to fit right. If you want a slip fit where it just slips over the edge and has to be tight all the way around it, the machines facilitated that. And I won't say that there weren't any before the machines came along, because there were, but they became much more common. And then you get other machines that do other things, and by mid-century, you're starting to see all kinds of heavy equipment for large tinsmith shops. So the craft changed a lot over the time.
So the tin that was for sale in the fill shop, that was shipped over from England, was probably made in these kind of like factory settings, or were they still being made by people?
So they even a factory
Yeah,
would have been
yeah.
made by
Yes.
hand,
But it's not
or
like
mostly
you,
handwork.
when you're out there like making it on
So even by 1855, it was still likely a small shop endeavor for much of England, but there were large manufactories that would employ hundreds of people doing it. So I'm guessing Hudson Bay bought from both, wherever they got the best deal, but probably the larger proportion of it came from the factory style. No, thank you all for your attention.
Cool.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you for doing it.
I put lights out there so it's not too dark when you're walking back to your cars, and then the gates should still be open, the exit gates of the car. But if you come across one and it's closed, just give my cell phone a call.
Oh, if anybody is interested, because I didn't include examples of tinware, I have some references over there if you want to just peruse for a couple minutes.
That was so
And then I
pretty.
also, if it's okay with you,
No,
it's
no,
this,
no. Yeah,
up
that's
on
still
the
pretty.
I'm
And
sorry.
when you have it on the collar,
Yeah.
I always say if something
Wanted
came to
to-
Tinsmiths, they look into place.
Yeah, and
Send
like
people
something,
to
what is it,
slides.
Irish traditions about you made mistakes in your work, but I'm not sure
If
that
anybody
it's
asks,
sort
go
of
ahead.
trapped.
Oh, yeah.
I like that. Yeah, it's